Well, the first time I ever heard about Cheley Camp was when your great Uncle John went to Cheley Camp as a 13-year-old boy when the camp was at Bear Lake. And at that time there was no girls' camp. And he went for 3 years, and then that was the end of his camping experience. But one early spring in 1930, I believe it was 1933, Daddy came home one night and said that Mr. Cheley was in town and going to go show his movies at the Amarillo Country Club, and he was taking me out there to see him because I was going to camp that summer. Well, I was 15 years old and I wasn't the least bit interested in going to camp at that age, and I said, oh, nobody goes to camp when they're 15. But Daddy said, well, you're going whether you want to go or not. And he said, it's a beautiful, beautiful place. And he said, this is a real financial sacrifice because this is right in the middle of the Depression. And he said, the 10 weeks of camp will cost $425. And just be prepared because you're going to go. Well, we went out to the country club and met this little round individual, Mr. Frank Cheley, and he showed these beautiful movies. And of course, it never occurred to me to disagree with my father. So when early June came along, here came almost a special car on Fort Worth and Denver, starting out in South Texas and ending up on the Burlington, starting up from Dallas, picking up Cheley campers from Texas to go to Colorado. And we were met at the Denver station by Mr. Cheley, who put us all on an old, not it wasn't necessarily an old, but it was a big, big open bus owned by the Rocky Mountain Transportation Company for no top. And the bus was absolutely full of Cheley campers. Well, we drove up to Estes Park, and part of the road wasn't even paved back in those days. And I think we went through the South St. Vrain that first summer, which ended up right at the edge of Cheley. Cheley Camp was right at the end of South St. Vrain, 6 miles southeast of Estes Park. Well, we drove into this place and had these beautiful, beautiful, big lodges built out of logs, and went on. We first went by the boys' camp, and the lodge there held the lodge and the boys' dining room. And then we went on down the road past the rifle range, girls' rifle range, and ended up at the girls' big lodge. And I was, back in those days, there were campers there from 6 to 20. So the little girls' camp, which was called Lower Chipeta, had little girls in it from 6 to 12. And the middle Chipeta had girls in it from 12 to 16. And senior camp had girls in it from 16 to 20. Hard to believe that there were girls there 20 years old. And there were also campers in that little girls' camp 6 years old. Well, back in those days, the cabins in Middle Chipeta had rooms, and each cabin had 4 rooms with 2 campers and a little separate room off to the side with for the counselor. And my roommate was a beautiful, big, tall girl from Council Bluffs, Iowa, named Ann Winslow. And the other girls in the cabin, there were 6 other girls, all of whom were from Ohio. And I remember the names of some of them. One was Ann Cashat, who became a very good friend of mine, and another one named B. Hoagland. And my counselor's name was Elizabeth Melbourne. I think I'm doing pretty good to remember the names of counselors for, what is it, 71, 70, 80, 81 years now. No,
Yes.
71 years. And the other girls were from Zanesville, Ohio. One of them was named Ruth. And I'm sorry to say I don't remember the names of the other ones, but I think I did pretty good to remember the names of the rest of them. Well, back in those days, we had a little round pot-bellied stove in the middle of the cabin to give us some heat. Because when the night came along in Estes Park, it was cold. Well, I remember the very first mountain, first pack trip. Well, it wasn't really a pack trip, it was an out camp. And we went down to Brainerd Lake, where we stayed in the Rocky Mountain Mountaineers cabin. And it had one big room down in the bottom with a great big black coal stove and a loft across the top where we could go up and sleep on mattresses on the top of the cabin. And there were probably, I would say 20 girls along with our out camp counselors. And our out camp counselor was named Marge Elliott. And our hiking counselor was a woman named Margaret Montagna, who we called Tex for some reason. But I also remember the first day, our day we got to camp, they tried to get us used to the high altitude by hike. And we went on an indoctrination hike around camp, and I remember this girl carrying along with up above us with big long legs and a big black hat on, and turned out to be a girl named Julie Menninger, who turned out to be one of my very best friends. And she was the daughter of Carl Menninger, the famous psychiatrist from Topeka, Kansas. Well, she was a born hiker. But that was the indoctrination hike. Well, our first trip down to Brainerd Lake was my first experience with mountain climbing. And we were to climb two mountains that day in the Indian Peak Range. One of them was called Paiute and the other one was Pawnee. Well, we were coming back across Paiute, and there was a long strip of snow and ice that we had to cross over. And Marge went along and kicked out steps across that. And as we started over, there was a girl right in front of me named Carmelita DaCosta. And we got out there, and Carmelita's feet went out from under her, and she went sliding down this snowbank, which was about, I would say 50 feet down this steep slope. And she got to the bottom, and her feet hit this big boulder and just threw her over. And she landed on her, thank goodness she landed on her backpack, or it probably would have broken her back. Well, I was right behind her, and I'd never climbed a mountain before, and I'd never been on snow like that before, and I absolutely froze. And I could not move. I was out in the middle of this thing, and I couldn't go forward, and I couldn't go backward, and I just sat there. And finally, the counselor came back and took me by the hand and got me off that mountain. And I'm surprised I ever climbed a mountain and climbed again, because it really terrified me to see her go down that mountain. Well, I will say that Mr. Cheley had so much to do when, as far as activities were concerned, it was just unbelievable. He had silversmiths from Kansas City to work in the craft shop. He had woodworkers. He had all kinds of people. Painting, oil painting, watercolors, photography. There was a woman there from Honolulu who taught hula. There was another one from Kansas City, she was from Missouri. I believe she was from Topeka also, who taught tap dancing. We had, later on we had fencing, we had archery, we had riflery, a woman named Vivian Buser, who also became a lifelong friend of mine, who taught riflery. We had all kinds of water sports, canoeing, butterfly canoeing, out camping, of course. We took the out camp trips all over Rocky Mountain National Park, which we could do back in those days. And we always used horses back in those days in the girls' camp because Mr. Cheley thought that backpacking was not good for girls. He thought it was too strenuous for girls. So we had we had horses. And well, as I say, there was a swimming pool, but and we would all swim if we could make ourselves do it, but it was very, very cold. And of course, the horseback riding program was one of the big programs. And at that time, Virginia Cheley, the daughter of Mr. Cheley, was our wrangler. And our assistant wrangler was a woman named Lois Smith from Amarillo. And the head wrangler in the girls' camp was a woman named Lois Crane. And Lois was from Cheyenne, Wyoming. And that particular year, she was queen of the Big Cheyenne Rodeo, which is at that time the biggest rodeo in the world. Calgary Rodeo caught up with it later, but that time Cheyenne Rodeo was the biggest in the world. Well, we were all very impressed with Lois because she came down with her black cowboy boots, her big outfit, and her white satin shirt, and ribbon across her chest that said Queen of the Rodeo, and a great big white hat. And she brought some of the cowboys who participated in the rodeo and some of the Indians, and they put on a performance for us. And it was very exciting, and as a 15-year-old, we were all very impressed with Craney. And Craney, again, was one of the ones who remained a lifelong friend of mine. And Craney's children, along with my children, later became campers, and their children. There are third generations, and now maybe possibly fourth generations of people attending Cheley Camp. Well, another thing that Mr. Cheley did, he brought this woman from Cleveland, Ohio, who was accustomed to putting on big pageants. And so we had a big pageant there. And in the boys' camp, there was a man named Earl Meglin, who was the social director, who put on a minstrel show and then a big counselor's show. And there was at night, Mr. Cheley came over and told stories for us, and he brought in other people to put on wonderful campfires for us. And one of them that lasted a whole week was a man named Charlie Eagleplume, who came over and acted out the story of two Indian stories, one called Queer Person, and I've forgotten what the other one was, but anyway, it was Ralph, his name was Hubbard, and he was the son of Ralph Hubbard. And Charlie Eagleplume came over, and he was an authority. He was part Indian, he was authority, and we were all, both girls and boys, were in the big lodge at the girls' camp. And he would tell these stories when it was almost dark, and I'll never forget, he had an Indian, he dressed like an Indian with the loincloth. He was nude except for that loincloth, and he had a feather in his hat. And right in the most tensest part of Queer Person, he climbed up on the big mantelpiece, and we couldn't see that he was up there. And he was up there on that big mantelpiece, and all of a sudden he leapt down with his yell, and everybody in camp just went out in orbit. It scared us so. And this Mr. Cheley came over at least once a week and told us historical stories and Indian stories about that part of the camp, about that part of Colorado, and a part of it about Estes Park. and it was very historic, and there was a lake there called Mary's Lake, where the Indians would come into that valley because it was very thick with wildlife back in the early days, and kill their meat for the winter. Well, I believe it was the Utes would wait until the Arapahoes had done the hunting and killing, and then they would come up and make a raid and try to kill them. And one year, the Arapahoes put their wives and their children on rafts and sent them out in Mary's Lake, and they had a big storm, and a whole bunch of them were drowned. And then there was a trail up over Trail Ridge called the Trail Where Women Walked, where the Indians would go across the top of the Continental Divide over trail, what later became Trail Ridge, and the men would ride, and they also put their beef on the horses, and the women would go along and hold on to the tails of the horses to go up over this pass, which was this road, which was over 12,000 feet, and they called it the Trail Where the Women Walk. And that trail is still visible when you go across Trail Ridge Road. Well, several times a week we had wonderful campfire programs. Mr. Cheley would come over and tell us stories of the early history, and especially the history of the Indians. And I might say that the camps were named for Indian women, men. Chipeta was apparently an Arapaho or a Ute princess, I'm not sure which. And the boys' camp was Yaha. The big boys' camp was named Yaha. And of course the young boys' camp was Lower Sky High, and the middle boys' camp was named Sky High. Those were not Indian names, but the older boys' camp was named after an Indian.